a remarkable several weeks and 3 people who are part of it. It is my pleasure to introduce to you, oh, wait a minute. Man, did you actually wear that? Is that how skinny you were back then? I was like, I am going to introduce to you Van McLeod, first of all. I think many of you know Van McLeod, Commissioner of Cultural Resources. And Van, can I ask you to, well, this is Tom Fields with Tom Fields Associates, and Bob Fiore, Director of Photography, over here. I'm going to pass the microphone to Van next. Maybe each of you can tell us one reminiscence of your own, and then I think there might be a lot of questions from the audience, and we'd love to hear some stories.
I'll start it. I mean, there are thousands of stories. Some of you have heard part of them. One that I don't know if most of you have heard, but on the train, somebody asked Janice, we were just hanging around, and if you want to come down, feel free to come down. It's easier to hear. But somebody asked Janice, you know, where'd you get that drummer? Because Full Tilt Boogie, which was the band she was playing there with, I mean, they were really hot. And they only did one album, which came out after she died. If you heard Me and Bobby McGee, was the last, that was not, she never sang that on the train. But to me, that was sort of the theme song of the train. James and the Good Brothers sang that, and because everybody was based in folk, which is where that comes from. And if you listen to Janice's version, it's just right there. But somebody's asked her, you know, where did you get that drummer? And she said, well, we were jamming, and I did a hip check, and he did a rim shot. And I said to him, where did you learn how to play like that? And he said, honey, I used to play for strippers. And she said, you're my drummer. This man here, Tom Field, was the first idiot to hire me when I got out of college. My first boss. Tom Field Associates, a very special person to me and a person I've looked up to for many years. So I'll pass it on to you, Tom.
Well, hello. Thank you. Glad to be here. This really was an amazing experience. We were involved because Hanley Sound, who was the real pioneer of festival sound probably in the country, tended to use our company for lighting. And it was very fortunate that we were able to do all this. One of the interesting things that had actually not much to do with the music is the FestivalExpress was meant to be longer. It was meant to start in Montreal and it was meant to end in Vancouver. But politically, it didn't really get much in the film, I don't think. But this was a bit of a hot potato. We were right in the middle of the Vietnam War. This was a whole bunch of hippies, so on and so forth. It was one of the reasons why they didn't start in Montreal, because they had too much political opposition. And we were all a bit nervous, to be honest with you. Here we were going up to Canada. We were going to a place full of railroad workers, you know, not exactly the hippie's best friend. And it was just amazing. In other words, they were so happy to have this special train, all right? It started out like magic right to begin with. And it pretty much stayed that way for the whole thing. It really was, it'll get mentioned, I know, sometimes, but I think usually what happens at any festival, all right, is the musicians come and the musicians go. One of the things that happened here is there was no place they could go, so they stayed. They watched the other groups, and as you can see what went on the train itself, it just was, it was an experience of a lifetime. I'm very lucky to be there. Can I say one more?
Sure.
The other thing, and Bob may be able to speak to it, we did a lot of festivals, and we also did the Newport Festival, so we worked with Janice, for example, a fair amount. And I have to tell you, I think some of the footage on this, under very primitive conditions, is probably some of the best footage ever shot of her. All right, and I just, very few lights, it was just really amazing. So, we have an artist in our midst.
Just to pass up, Bob Fiore I did not know on the train. I saw him work many times. And he actually, it comes from Plymouth, New Hampshire, and lives in New Hampshire, and we discovered 40-some years later that he's here. After the train itself, and I tried to carry equipment around, Tom gave me a hard time a little while ago, just a couple of days ago. He said, you mean you were carrying their equipment and working for me? Well, yeah. But I actually, because of that experience, I decided to go to film school, and Bob Fiore.
Hi. I'm a cinematographer, and was hired to do this project. Can you hear me there? There you go. I was hired to do this project. The director, who subsequently died from cancer, was named Frank Stefanovic from London. And in those days, rock and roll consisted of being handed a carton box full of rolls of unshot film and being told, go film. There wasn't any playback. We didn't see anything that we shot. And there wasn't any headsets or any kind of communication. So you're pretty much on your own. I had discovered, because I had worked on Gimme Shelter the year before in New York, where all the concert footage in Gimme Shelter was filmed, that the best place to be was on the stage. So in this situation where there was very little organization, everything I filmed was from the stage, which was the most interesting. At one point when I was filming the Grateful Dead, I think in that scene in the afternoon that they're playing, I was standing next to Bobby Weir, and Bobby said, "You might want to move." And I said, well, and this was in the middle of a song, I said, "Why?" And he said, and he pointed behind me, and there was a little brass cannon. And they took a couple of steps to the side, and they shot it off. It's not in the film. Fortunately, it didn't hit me. That was kind of the thing I like about this film is that I've actually filmed a lot of rock and roll people and gone through the whole evolution from extremely primitive, but in some way really immediate performance, like this film is, to really highly produced and filmed and edited rock and roll pieces. The thing I like is that the artists are really trying to perform and really trying to communicate. And I think it really comes through in what makes this film, in spite of some problems, what makes it so interesting. It took about 30 years, more than 30 years for this film to actually get finished. And the main reason was that among all that fighting with the producers is they ran out of money and didn't pay a lot of people. So the people took the film or their audio tapes or whatever they'd made home with them, hoping that they could eventually exchange them for money, which didn't happen. And the producers got in a large, got in an argument that went on for years. And it wasn't really until the people who were actually involved in the making of this film, or producing the concert, when they died, that the son of one of the producers then attempted to assemble all this footage, and he had to travel all over Canada, finding bits and pieces. And then he worked out of London, and they put the film together. One of the reasons, from my point of view, that really worked out well is that although there were lighting people, they were for the performances. There was nobody to light on the train, which is where I was. And I don't know if you've ever been on a train, but there's almost no lighting on a train. And the only trains are DC current rather than AC, and they only have 50-watt bulbs that screw in backwards so that you won't steal them. So when I got there, it turned out there was absolutely no lighting. Now I had started filming with Maisels in New York and Don Pennybaker, and they pretty much had the attitude that you just went and filmed, and you hoped it came out all right. And so that's what I did. I just went and filmed everything that I could. I didn't think that you could see anything that was actually happening on the train because it was so dark. But with the miracle of digital video, it's possible to go back and retransfer film that was already almost 40 years old and increase the color and increase the amount of light so that it actually was an image. So this film, if it had actually been finished at the time that we made it, probably would be unwatchable. But now, through the miracle of video, it's actually quite beautiful. So, thank God.
There's plenty of stories we could tell, because all of us lived in different parts of this, but any questions? Let's take some questions from the audience. and we'll repeat them. Yes, here.
Why Canada?
Why Canada? Why not? That's where the producers work, basically, and we didn't really have the same cross-country train. I've been on that train about 3 times now, going across country. If you ever want a really great trip, go, take it from Montreal all the way to Vancouver. We don't have that here in this country. Yes, in the back.
Just wondering, did you ever interview any of the employees, the train conductors or anything like that? And what did they think about driving all those people across the country?
I didn't actually do any of the interviews. All the interviews were done later when the film was put together in London. I think there was so much going on that I don't think anybody ever thought about doing that. And there are some shots looking out the window of the train, and I do remember Frank, the director, asking me to film them. And I said, well, I'll do it, and I did. And I thought, well, what would you ever use something like this for? It works.
Look, on that, back then, very different thinking about it as we would today as far as the documentary goes. So there were a lot of things that were not covered exactly like that, that today would be done completely different. Yeah.
And I'd also add one other thing. These things tended to be very, whoops.
More
Close, close.
Tend to be back then tended to be very last minute. I believe they didn't really do the deal on this film until maybe a week before. All right, so there was no time to prep for it. I mean, Woodstock was almost as bad, but I think they had 2 weeks. So it just, there was no time to think that kind of stuff through.
With that in mind too, if what we're planning to do after the questions, there's another, some outtakes in the film that are really some interviews with some of the performers, how they felt, and then there's a little piece about the people who made the film, 30 years later. So if you want to stay, we'll show that as well. Yes?
Were they, all performers, were they as congenial as what was showing us on the film? Or did they have some real testy times also with each other?
I never saw personally, I never saw a testy time. I saw people unite, work together. And the last day you could see it in Calgary. I mean, it was one big jam. It was Delaney's birthday, actually, in Calgary, and we were hoping and we were thinking that, who was it? Good. Somebody was going to fly in, because Delaney and Bonnie and friends, everybody just loved to jam, and you saw some of that on the train. But to me, and I was lucky, because I worked at night, and I put the scaffolding and all that stuff together. During the day, I got to hang out and hang around. And it was interesting too, if you look, every one of the Grateful Dead scenes shot during the day. They were not a headline act in 1970. Sure.
If I could add just one more thing. I don't think that almost any of the musicians on the train actually knew each other before being on the train. And when you think about what it's like to be a musician, you go and you play and you travel, but you actually never get to meet anybody. So I don't think that it was a new experience for everyone. And one of the reasons the film is so interesting is because the musicians are really learning about each other as well as we're learning about them. And also, just one other little point is that although Woodstock had been shot before this film, it had not been released yet. And Gimme Shelter had also been shot before this film, but had not been released. So that the whole idea of a rock and roll movie was still an unknown quantity. Nobody knew anything about it. And nobody knew about being a star and being a movie star and being all that kind of thing. So all the people on the train were acting really very genuinely and not really understanding what we now think of as a rock and roll movie. And I think it's very genuine, their interaction. And one other little note, just of curiosity, is that there were songs all day long, and there were 2 people who knew every song. One was Jerry Garcia,
That's right.
and the other was Buddy Guy. Buddy Guy knew every song everybody played.
Any stories about Leave on Hell?
No.
I don't really have
He wasn't
any.
on the train. The
The band.
yeah, the band, except for what's his name, manual that's in the scene on the thing. The rest of the band didn't travel on the train, so they didn't actually interact with the other musicians. Rick Danko, that's who it is. He was the only one who was on the train, and he was only there that night for the party.
When Janis Joplin was on the screen, all I could think of was how few months she had to live, and wondering after that intimate experience traveling, what the impression was on you when you found that out when she did pass away only a few months later.
For me personally, it was really interesting, because the night we had the People's Bar, when we stopped the train and bought the booze, that was the night Janis taught me how to drink tequila, and that's another story. And she actually said, after she did that, she gave me a bottle of Jose Cuervo Gold and said, here, you can drink this all night, you won't get drunk. And she was correct. The trick to that is just don't stop. But I went home in the fall to Warner, where my mother had a farm. I was living in Boston. And a friend of mine who knew that story called me up and said, I hear you're in town, come on over, let's drink some tequila. I woke up the next morning and Janis was dead. She was the saddest lady I ever knew. She really was. And you see that first song where she's singing about love and where is he now, he's gone. I didn't know this until quite a bit later, but she had basically just broken up with a boyfriend, the only real boyfriend she had all her life. No other questions?
Was there a time on the train when everybody was sleeping on the bus or on the train, or was everyone always awake?
Actually, I think I would correct myself, and that is because we got on the train when we closed in Toronto, and all the equipment had to get on and all of that, so we left, really late. And the first morning, I got up and it was just me and one other guy in the breakfast car, which was the bar car, get a cup of coffee and a donut. And we just sat down and talked to each other. He ended up picking up a guitar and playing, and I said, geez, you're really good. He said, thanks very much. It wasn't until we got to Winnipeg that I found out that it was Garcia. But other than that, the train was just popping the entire time.
It reminded me of a real tricky Polar Express. I just had that in the back of my mind the whole time.
You're strange. Any other thoughts or questions? One of these, it's really interesting what Bob was talking about was, as a camera person, being able to get on the stage. This was a time before you had to go through all kinds of agents, before you had to do anything. Now you got to sign releases with anybody, even if you get a snapshot of them a little bit. Then it was very free. It was very, very different.
Good old days.
The good old days. Yeah.
The party, how long did that actually go on?
As soon as we left, as soon as we woke up after the first gig in Toronto, all the way until we finished in Calgary. And the party continued off the train as well. As a matter of fact, one of the things that we did in Calgary, we all got off and it was the middle of the Stampede, the Calgary Stampede. So everybody ran out and bought cowboy hats and belts and buckles and all that kind of stuff. Here's my buckle from the train. But it's, so it just did not stop. And you see the last, Janis, I think pretty much always closed it. And there were people coming up on stage jamming all the time. There's another in the back.
Oh, I got a tech question. Did you shoot 16 millimeter, and after 40 years, did you find the negatives were turning reddish?
Yes, this is shot in 16 millimeter. It's color film, obviously. Reversal? Probably negative. No, if it were reversal, it would be too contrasty. You would never be able to have it look like this. All the film is processed in London, so I didn't actually see it. But my feeling is it probably did turn red and lost color, but that can all be replaced in the digital video transfer. In fact, you can make it look a lot better than it ever did to start with.
That's great. Thank you for restoring and putting it out.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? Do you guys want to see the other Okay, so Connie, can we,
Yeah, well, just give us a second, we'll put the projector on. Might have to change the setting, but hold tight.
okay. Any other good stories?
Yeah, I have the next thing.
How much did they lose, money-wise, like at the end of the day?
It was a lot.
That doesn't matter.
It was enough so that everybody hated everybody. And there was a fight that went on for literally for years.
The promoters, not the artists.
Among the musicians, it was fine. And actually, for myself and part of the crew, it was fine. But other people felt ripped off. I just have one little story about that question about when Janis died. And one of the things that happened is after this film, I ended up becoming quite friendly with the Grateful Dead and would go to see them whenever they played in New York. And they played at the Fillmore East the night of the day that Janis died. And the Jefferson Airplane was there also, and both bands got on the stage and played a kind of memorial concert for Janis. And at that time, Janis was in New York a lot, and she would often wear a large white sort of fake fur hat. And in the middle of the concert, some woman appeared wearing clothes a lot like Janis's and this white hat. And one other thing is that whenever you're around the Grateful Dead, you have to be extremely careful what you eat or drink. And everybody was sure that this was an hallucination and a manifestation of her spirit for one reason or another.
Van, the outtakes are ready.
Okay, one quick story that we heard. One of the fun things that happened, I went down to Boston on Wednesday night and met with Judy, who was with Hanley Sound. She was in it just a moment, and she was a key to pretty much every festival that happened anywhere. But she told a great story of on Ian's birthday, of Ian and Sylvia. And Tom, why don't you tell us?
Well, they decided they would get Ian a cake.
That's closer to you.
Oh, yeah. We get Ian a cake, and Judy was in charge of getting it and making it ready. And she got it all done, she had the candles lit, and all of a sudden this flash came by. It was the road manager for the Grateful Dead. He had a little bottle. He just sprayed the cake and ran off. And she thought about what should she do, and she's a pretty straight person, but she decided she'd give the cake out. Well, it nearly killed Ian. I mean, it was a disaster, but LSD does amazing things. I'd also like to say one of the interesting things both about the producers or promoters of this and the key people in Woodstock, when they realized, and in both places, the event turned into an economic disaster, all right, and they knew that probably by the first or second day of it, they all elected to keep the thing going, and they kept spending money on it. That was really amazing, and they, deserve a huge amount of credit for doing that.
Okay, we'll see these outtakes.
More t-shirts like that?
Sorry. $5,000. No. Not for sale.